Hi everyone, welcome to our first online lecture for the semester. Hope you're all doing well and keeping safe. For this lecture, we're going to be looking at vernacular and documentary photography, and the lecture will be split into several parts just to make it a bit easier for you to listen and be able to take breaks in between this. So first off, I'll be going over an overview of what vernacular and documentary photography is. So this lecture will focus on photography's ability to capture the hidden, the mundane, the awkward, the intimate, the humorous, the serious, and in general, the everyday. So we're going to look at and discuss how photographers can not just show something, but how they also play a hand in the interpretation of the subject matter. So we'll be looking at the overview, historically, how this began, where it comes from, and then go into more detail about the snapshot aesthetic and what it is, and finally look more into how intimacy is conveyed as well as family life through vernacular photography. So starting off, what does vernacular mean and what is vernacular? So this is just a general dictionary definition of vernacular. So the idea is that this is coming from more of the idea of vernacular language. So the idea is that it's spoken by ordinary people. So he wrote in the vernacular to reach a large audience. So in this context, it's talking about everyday language, spoken language, colloquial speech, conversational language, common parlance, jargon, slang, informal. So the key things to take away from here are everyday, colloquial, common, informal. So if you're thinking about vernacular, how would vernacular, what would you imagine that to fit into? In my mind, something that I think of in terms of an Australian vernacular, a great example of that would be the iconic Australian film, The Castle, in terms of showing and representing just a regular average family doing regular average family things, sort of this idea of the mundane and the typical and the common. The Castle really exemplifies that, specifically in this case, this screenshot from the film, a family dinner, which sort of is archetypal and typical for any family sitting around a dinner table. So this is just what would you think in terms of the everyday, the mundane, the regular? This is where you should start thinking from. But you'll see how it's approached in very different ways. So you're probably wondering about the documentary aspect that and its relationship to vernacular. So I've taken this definition from the Tate, which is a London gallery. They have multiple galleries, and they have a great website that I really recommend you use. They have a lot of images on there, a lot of photographic work, a lot of resources. So they've defined documentary photography as a style of photography that provides a straightforward and accurate representation of people, places, objects, and events, and is often used in reportage. So in this instance, documentary photography can then be broken down into social documentary work and contemporary art. So the idea is that documentary photography chronicles events and environments relevant to history and the historical, but it also depicts the everyday. When we think about documents, we think that it's an objective, unbiased, form of truth or reality. That's what we assume. But we know that within art and within all work, there is subjectivity. So how does an image attempt to communicate truthfulness or reality without subjectivity, and does this matter? So this is where we start talking about indexicality and visual trace within a photograph. This is also another great resource that I mentioned earlier on in the trimester, which I did put a link in the resources on the Learning Griffith course content page. So there is an online link to Griffith Library, and you can read this book edited by Liz Wells about Photography Critical Introduction. So the idea of indexicality is that it goes hand in hand with photography. So it's about, indexicality is about a sign pointing to or indexing to something. So this fits under semiotic theory, and it's the idea that the indexical sign is based in cause and effect. So Liswell writes here, for example, the footprint in wet sand indicates a trace or recent presence. The other two types of signs are the iconic, which is based in resemblance, and the symbolic. So in terms of photography, it could be understood in the sense that a photograph is an object imprinted by light, traditionally, that's what it is. But it also, in the other sense, it also depicts the visual likeness of something truthful or something that is real. It's not reality itself, but it depicts the visual likeness of something that is real. So here in the same quote, Liswell writes that the manner in which a photograph can be understood to be a chemical trace or imprint via the passage of light or an existing or once existing physical object. So the idea that if you're photographing a person or a place, this existed in time. It may not exist anymore, but in the photograph it does. So this idea here connects photography very closely to memory, the past, presence, absence, and death. So photographs are tangible evidence of things' existence. So indexicalability is the relationship between the object photographed and the resulting image. So there's another term to think about and ideas in this, the idea of photographic truth, is that the photograph depicts a visual likeness of something that is true or real. So it has the appearance of being true or real. Here, this definition is more from a literary scope. So the idea is that the detail gives the novel some verisimilitude. So that's this idea of visual likeness. So in the photograph itself, even in a documentary photograph, there is subjectivity. And that subjectivity can be through the photographer's interpretation, lighting, angles, and point of view. A lot of theorists have written about this, including Susan Sontag, who's a key theorist who's written this text I recommend you all reading called On Photography. So she explains that in deciding how a picture should look and preferring one exposure to another, photographers are always imposing standards on their subjects. Although there is a sense in which the camera does indeed capture reality, not just interpret it, photographs are just as much an interpretation of the world as paintings are and drawings are. So very early on, I guess, photography was not considered fine art, so this kind of comes under that realm of a photograph being objective when it necessarily isn't. So it's part of that discussion as well. So I'll let you sort of think about that, and we'll move on to the second part if you would like a break. Okay, so in part two, we're looking at the historical within vernacular and documentary photography. So where did this idea of vernacular photograph begin, and how has that informed this aesthetic and this viewpoint? So going back to the 1800s. So this is a photograph by Louis Daguerre of a very busy street in Paris in 1838 or 1839. It is believed to be the first photograph of a living person. You're probably looking at it thinking that it doesn't look very busy, but it is, even though you can only see two people. So this is the idea that the cameras they're using at the time, this is a daguerreotype created by Louis Daguerre in 1838. It's not the first photographic process, but it changed the availability and accessibility of photography. So this camera had very long shutter speeds, and everyone else in the street and the carrot, whatever there was, would have been moving, but this shoe shiner and the man having his shoe shined would have been still for a long enough period to be captured in this photograph. So could it be the first street photograph of people? Who knows? But very much so. It's a very exciting image at a time where a lot of these photographs are being produced in the studio, and you're not getting depictions of people moving on streets and what this street life was. So if we go back to the discussion of daguerreotypes and the role they played in photography's process, daguerreotypes are the first publicly available photographic process. So the fact they were accessible and publicly available meant that people were setting up these studios and being able to charge customers to come and have their portraits taken. So it was very widely used in the 1840s, 1850s. As I mentioned before, it had very long exposure times, with sitters required to be very still, and they had chairs with devices attached to to keep their heads still. So you can see in this this photograph here, the man has this attachment holding his head straight so he doesn't move, and it's a studio setup here. And through this accessibility with the cheaper and quicker methods than previously available, people were visiting these studios to take family portraits, which they would keep in very precious lockets and other sort of memorabilia, sort of this idea of capturing memory. And there comes class and who could afford this, obviously, into play as well. A key thing that is viewable through this is that what was very common at the time was postmodern photography. So during this period, the 19th century, death was considered an everyday part of life. And people wanted to memorialize their loved ones, and photography became a very important part of that. And this idea of memento mori and memorialization was very important in the Victorian period. But an odd thing you do see is this idea of hidden mothers, like draped in black, holding dead babies, as well as women who were slaves, so African women in America who were nannies. So quite strange undertones of the images. So it was a very big trend in the 19th century, this idea of the photograph memorializing loved ones, but the idea that the photograph could capture your family and you could keep that as a keepsake. But you'd have to go to the studio. So it's only when George Eastman, who founded the Eastman Kodak Company in 1988, produced this accessible alternative which people could actually have cameras at home. They didn't have to go to a studio anymore. So it was safer and easier. You didn't have to work with complex modes of processing and printing. You could send it off to the Eastman factory and they did it all for you. It was simple and inexpensive, using box brownies and roll film. So this really changed what was possible in terms of photography and who was able to use it. So as you can see here, they started advertising to women and everyday people, not just professionals, and photography started moving out of the studio. So we'll go on to part 3 now. So if you want to go to the next lecture slide, we'll open that up.